Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back amongst all of you. We are certainly honored to be able to continue to do our work on behalf of the American people. And on a day like this, September 11th, of course, where we remember the great tragedy of that day, many of us will always remember where we were when the news broke that the towers had been struck. And then, of course, it became clear that it was a terrorist attack. And seeing the image of that first tower falling is indelibly burned into my memory, as I'm sure it is every single American who witnessed that. And so we remain committed to protecting the homeland. We're thankful for all of our first responders. We're thankful for the men and women of the American military and their sacrifice in Afghanistan and in other theaters of war across the world. We certainly remain committed to making sure that the first responders who sacrificed so much, not just on that day, of course, most powerfully, but in the days, the weeks, the months, and the years to come, and have suffered as a result of that selfless sacrifice, illnesses that have ripped apart their bodies in often invidious ways, that they will never have to be concerned again that they won't have access to the health care necessary to ensure that they can live the best quality of life moving forward under difficult circumstances. And that is why we were proud to have passed legislation sent to the president's desk, led by Speaker Pelosi, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, and the House Democratic Caucus to continue to stand with those 9/11 first responders. And that simply is a reminder for all of us as to why we are here in Washington, D.C., which fundamentally is to get things done and to make life better for the everyday American. And so when we as House Democrats say that we're fighting for the people, we mean it. At our best, that is what we do. We fight for working families, middle-class folks, senior citizens, young people, veterans, the poor, the sick, the afflicted, the least, the lost, the left behind. That's what we do at our best. It's not a slogan, we mean it. And we're reminded of that today. And so as we're back here in Washington, D.C., we are committed to getting things done. We want to drive down the high costs of life-saving prescription drugs for everyday Americans. We want to enact a real infrastructure plan that fixes our crumbling bridges, roads, tunnels, airports, public housing developments, mass transportation systems. And we want to deal with the gun violence epidemic in America. Everyday innocent Americans are being massacred. They are dying on our streets. Not in Kabul, not in Baghdad, but in Dayton, in El Paso, in Brooklyn, in Chicago, in South Central Los Angeles, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, at a church in Charleston, South Carolina. And we can't do anything about it? We can't find the courage, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans to do something to stop the carnage? It's time for Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans to act. We've done our job in the House of Representatives to get things started. Passed universal criminal background check legislation in a bipartisan way. Sent it over to the Senate in February. And the Senate Republicans can't see fit to move on legislation that 90% of the American people support when innocent Americans are being massacred on our streets. And so we're going to continue to make the case to the American people that we, as a Congress, need to act, led by the Senate at this moment. The House Judiciary Committee, of course, took further steps yesterday on the issue of gun safety, but the ball is in the Senate's court right now. Let me yield to our distinguished Vice Chair from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the dynamic Katherine Clark.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your eloquent comments, as always, on 9/11, the solemn day that we commemorated this morning with a moment of silence on the Capitol steps. And as we think about 9/11 and those first responders, as the chairman mentioned, and our gratitude towards them, it does make me think of the recess that we just had, where we lost 53 American lives in mass shootings. Just over the month of August, a time when we are home with our own families and our constituents' families, and should be a time to reconnect and to reinvigorate about the work we have to do here on their behalf. And to have this public health crisis, just continue to become part of the daily fabric of American lives with no response from Mitch McConnell and the Senate. And just yesterday, we had a panel on gun violence that represented all the people that were involved in 9/11 and this new threat to our public health and national security. We had a former police chief from St. Louis. We had a veteran who works with veterans, preventing veteran suicide in Colorado. We had the mayor of Parkland talking about schools in our communities. We had an emergency room doctor who is also a gun violence survivor. And we had a March for Our Lives activist in Ariel Hobbs from Houston. And Ariel said her entire phone, all her contacts, are based on a web of death from gun violence. And as we looked at that panel, that's what it was. It was a web of death. And we have this moment. It has been almost 200 days since we passed universal background checks and closing the loophole that allowed the shooter to get a gun in Charleston and carry out those massacres during a time of worship. 200 days. And Mitch McConnell, instead of coming back in August and holding a vote, continues to stonewall, to make sure that he is hiding behind a president who is hiding behind the NRA. And we can do better. And the American people are demanding it. And we are not going to let up the pressure that we have a public health crisis that has an answer. As the chairman said, we are not ineffective here. This is not a problem that doesn't have a solution. We can make common sense steps to make sure the guns stay out of the hands of people who are a threat to others or to themselves, so that we can reduce suicide rates, that we can make sure that our veterans who have gone to serve after 9/11, when they come home, that they are safe and they can rebuild their lives. We can ensure that there are red flag laws so that when we have warnings, we're able to prevent them. We can make sure that our communities can address trauma and make sure that we are having those mental health supports, because we have so many witnesses now of this violence. This cannot become to define who we are as a country. And we have the tools to act, and we have them in Congress. But it is way past time that Mitch McConnell and the U.S. Senate take these bills up, make a difference for the American people. And today, on 9/11, let's make a pledge for American security against gun violence.
Thank you, Katherine. Any questions?
question if you are in an impeachment inquiry or not. So can you just right now set the record straight? Essentially, do you agree with Chairman Nadler that you are in an impeachment inquiry currently?
Well, I agree with the chairman that we're in the midst of a Judiciary Committee investigation, which is appropriate, that will consider the obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and culture of corruption that has come out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Those are issues that are squarely within the Judiciary Committee's jurisdiction. And as part of that investigation, of course, as Chairman Nadler has said, at some point in the future, we're going to have to determine whether to recommend charges that the president has engaged in high crimes or misdemeanors.
But it seems like you're trying to avoid saying impeachment inquiry. Are you in an impeachment inquiry? Is the committee, do you agree, in an impeachment inquiry?
Well, I have to take a look at the resolution. As you know, I'm a member of the committee. The resolution will be before us tomorrow. The four corners of the resolution aren't something that I've had an opportunity to review. We were in the midst of an extensive markup yesterday that lasted into the night to deal with the issue of gun safety and gun violence prevention. We'll move on as Judiciary Committee members, myself included, to deal with what's before us as it relates to that resolution tomorrow, and then we'll make some determinations as to characterization. But I don't want to get caught in semantics. We all agree, from Speaker Pelosi through every single member of the House Democratic Caucus, that we have a constitutional responsibility to hold an out-of-control executive branch accountable. We don't work for Donald Trump. We work for the American people. We are charged with being a check and balance. That includes oversight over the executive branch and the president. That's what 6 committees are doing, not simply the Judiciary Committee. And the committee should be allowed to do their work without getting caught up into semantical distinctions.
You all marked up gun bills yesterday to put on the House floor, but Mitch McConnell said he won't bring anything forward unless it's going to receive a presidential signature. Are you all working with the White House on what measures they might agree to so that you guys could find some common ground, or do you just plan on pushing ahead with the bills that were approved yesterday?
Well, those are decisions that will have to be made, I think, by the Rules Committee, the Speaker, Steny Hoyer, Jerry Nadler, in terms of timing of the floor votes. We are committed to continuing to appropriately and aggressively move forward and deal with the gun violence epidemic that we have in this country. The time for talk is over. The time for action is now. House Democrats are acting. The president needs to act. The Senate Republicans need to act.
Sure. I think one of the problems we have with the White House is a president who leads by chaos and does 180s on this all the time. After we saw the tragedies in El Paso and Dayton, the president said he supported universal background checks, had a conversation with the NRA and changed his mind. So for Mitch McConnell to try and sort of tuck himself in behind the president and his ever-evolving stand on issues is inappropriate when we are facing the kind of public health crisis that Americans are facing, when we have fear of going to movie theaters, to church, to garlic festivals. It is unacceptable. You don't want to vote for it? Don't vote for it. But put it before the Senate. And I think the real fear for Mitch McConnell is he knows if he puts it on the floor, it will pass, because it is what the American people are demanding. And it is common sense. And to see this drift backwards towards the gun lobby and hiding behind the president's chaos is truly unacceptable. And we are going to continue to call that out until we get a vote on these bills.
Beyond those bills, more than 200 members of your caucus have signed on to an assault weapons ban. And I'm wondering, do each of you support an assault weapons ban, and do you envision that coming to the floor for a vote?
Well, I'm a co-sponsor of the legislation that has been put forward by David Cicilline. And I think the next step that should be taken is the Judiciary Committee hold a hearing on the issue, which I expect consistent with what Jerry Nadler has indicated, he would like to schedule sooner rather than later. And then we can gather the information as it relates to the impact of the previous assault weapons ban, which I think clearly shows lives were saved. But we need to make a determination as to where the entirety of the House Democratic Caucus is on that particular issue. Though I will say, as it relates to high-capacity magazine clips, which we took steps toward limiting yesterday on the House Judiciary Committee, that functionally will deal with a lot of the challenges of the mass shootings and massacres that we've seen. Because it is the ability to have hundreds of rounds that can be unloaded on the American people, not in hours, not in minutes, but in some instances in seconds, as we saw in Dayton and in Orlando, in the Pulse nightclub, and in other places, that leads to the carnage. And so the assault weapons issue is one that I think the House Judiciary Committee will help us confront. But we have taken steps that directly deal with the issue of the massacres and the intensity of the carnage as it relates to limiting the availability of high-capacity magazine clips. I know you asked Catherine as well what her position was.
Yeah, I also am a co-sponsor of the assault weapons ban and don't believe that we should have a military-style weapons on our streets. And I think one of the important points that came out of the testimony yesterday from the former chief in St. Louis was the threat that these weapons, these high-capacity weapons, and the chairman's absolutely right, that is the central point of this, is that police officers often cannot respond with the same level of being armed in a rapid situation that unfolds. And so this really poses a safety threat not only to the public, but to our law enforcement as well.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you worry that putting that bill on the floor would give credence to Republicans who say Democrats want to take Americans' guns away and maybe hurt some of your moderate members?
Well, I don't think, from my standpoint, we're in a position to speculate about what will help or what will hurt. We want to do the right thing. Part of the right thing, it seems to me, is to ponder the question, are assault weapons weapons of war? Who are assault weapons designed to target? Are they being used to hunt deer, or are they being used to hunt human beings? It's a question that can be asked in the context of a Judiciary Committee hearing. We can get the information. We can make whatever case needs to be made to the American people. We do know that at this moment, over 60% of the American people, which includes independents and Republicans, support dealing with the assault weapons issue.
On funding the government, the deadline is September 30th. Will there be a government shutdown? And can you give us any update on the timeline for a continuing resolution?
No, there will not be a government shutdown with respect to the unless the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue throws another temper tantrum, and we can't take ownership of that. But the House Democratic position is clear. Fund the government, and if it requires continued negotiation, because once again, the Senate has failed to do its job. Under Chairwoman Nita Lowey's leadership, we've passed all of the Appropriations Committee bills. Steny Hoyer has brought those bills to the floor. They've successfully been sent out of the House over to the Senate, and once again, the Senate has fallen down on the job. So if there's a continuing resolution required to keep the government open, it seems to me that that's something that the overwhelming majority, if not the entirety of the House Democratic Caucus, will support. But the timing on that will be determined by Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. No questions on this side of the room? I want to show some, I'm fair and balanced.
Back to guns for a second. Leader McConnell has asked Chairman Graham to write this red flag law, which is Blumenthal. We've heard some grumbling from Democrats that would be an insufficient response to these shootings and background checks is the way to go. But is there a compromise here where you could do something like a red flag bill and just get it passed into law as some form of progress and then return to background checks? Or would you insist that background checks are a part of any gun reform response?
Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer have been very clear. Bring the Universal Criminal Background Check bill to the floor. That is the starting point. There are other things that can be done to deal with the issue, including red flag laws, hate crime prevention legislation, high-capacity magazine clip legislation, as the House Judiciary Committee just did yesterday. But universal criminal background check legislation is the starting point. And we need a national standard. Things have gotten a lot better in Brooklyn, but there are still too many innocent lives that are lost in Brooklyn, or lost in Chicago, or lost in South Central Los Angeles. But guess what? A majority of the guns that are used to commit crimes in New York City don't come from New York City or New York State. In many ways, they come from the neighboring state of Pennsylvania or up the Iron Pipeline from states in the Deep South. The guns that are used to commit crime in the south side of Chicago don't really come from Illinois, but they come from the neighboring states of Indiana and Wisconsin. And in South Central Los Angeles, the situation is the same thing. Things have gotten a lot better in South Central, just like they have in Brooklyn, but there are still lives that are being lost. And many of those guns come from the neighboring states of Nevada, as we recently saw, and in Arizona. So we need a national standard, and we can start with universal criminal background check legislation.
Quick follow-up to that. Does that mean, we know you're pushing for HR 8, which is universal background check legislation, but does that mean you wouldn't accept something like a Manchin Toomey, which if it was anything similar to what it was in 2013, would have more exemptions than something like HR 8 would?
Well, I don't want to get into the particulars of negotiating between the House and the Senate. That's done with the committee chairs and, of course, by our leadership at the highest level, Speaker Pelosi. But we recognize that we're in a bicameral situation. We just need the Senate to act like they are a separate and co-equal part of the situation, not a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump administration or the NRA. And if we can get a functional Senate that's willing to talk about the substance of bills in good faith, then we can get something done on behalf of the American people.
In last night's special election, it was close for Democrats, and the inner suburban precincts went better. But in the rural ex-urban precincts, they got redder and more conservative. Are you worried about the long-term impact, whether your agenda is turning those Trump voters even more Trumpy?
No, as long as we continue to forcefully advocate an agenda designed to make life better for everyday Americans, with a focus on things like driving down the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs and enacting a real infrastructure plan, I believe we will have the best case to make as to what we stand for as Democrats, which is fighting for working families, middle-class folks, seniors, young people, folks in urban America, rural America, and suburban America. It was never a race, I think, that should have been as close as it turned out to be. It was an R+9 race. It was not a pickup opportunity for us. Not a pickup opportunity in the context of what we needed to win our majority. It was a necessary hold for them. And it was a district that Donald Trump won by 12 points in 2016. And so we overperformed by 10. And if you actually look at the 2018 midterm elections, overperforming by 10 was basically the cutoff line as it relates to the races that we were successful in. And so we believe that we are in just as strong a position electorally, to the extent that you can use any special election, which is always unique, to determine or forecast what's going to happen in the next cycle. But I think the results speak for themselves. They needed to win it. They squeaked by. And I don't think any Republican in the House who's concerned about his or her electoral prospects can feel better about the situation. Last observation, there are 25 current House incumbents in districts that they won by 5 points or less. There are almost 40 who are in districts that they won by 10 or less. I wouldn't feel good about their electoral prospects right now if I were them, looking at what just happened in North Carolina.
On that note, are there any lessons the Democrats can take from the special, though? It looks like maybe black voters didn't turn out on the same level. Should we do anything for 2020 in a year that Donald Trump's going to be on the ballot for the House?
I think we'll take a look at where there may have been some electoral drop-off in terms of turnout. I am extremely confident that you will see an intense level of turnout amongst African Americans in 2020 with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket.
As a member of the Judiciary Committee, what more do you think you need to know, or what questions do you have for you to make a determination of whether you think that articles of impeachment against the president are worthwhile?
Well, from the standpoint of whether articles of impeachment are worthwhile or not, that's a group exploration that I think Jerry Nadler has indicated the Judiciary Committee is on. And I look forward to enthusiastically participating in that journey, as I've done to date. And initially, the first context was our approach to the Mueller report and the Mueller hearing, but we still are fighting for the grand jury material. We still are fighting for the underlying documentation connected to the Mueller report. And we are confronting incredible stonewalling by an administration. And so we're going to have to resolve that conflict. And the only way to resolve a conflict between the Article 1 legislative branch and the Article 2 executive branch is through the Article 3 court system. We're winning in New York. We won in the Southern District. We're winning in Washington, D.C. We won in the D.C. District Court. I expect favorable decisions as it relates to House Democrats as a separate and co-equal branch of government getting access to the documentation that we're seeking, which includes the Deutsche Bank records at issue in the Second Circuit of New York and the accounting records at issue in the D.C. Circuit Court. We have to follow the facts, apply the law, be guided by the Constitution. That's what we're doing. We all agree with that. And until we get access to the documents and the fact witnesses like Don McGahn, it's hard to comment and speculate on what else we need to see before figuring out how to proceed.
How important is how the public feels? The Speaker has said that to move forward, it would have to be overwhelming and bipartisan and have the public support. But as we saw over the August recess, the public hasn't really shifted much in their views of whether impeachment is worth it.
Well, public sentiment is always important. And that was clear to us over the last 2 years as we dealt with the issue of health care, protecting people with pre-existing conditions, and fighting against the GOP tax scam. Public sentiment on any issue is always important.
Yeah, I think that our goal is to get the truth to the American people, and that is what is going to change public sentiment. And we have just seen an unprecedented level of stonewalling of witnesses. So, as the chairman said, the Judiciary Committee is voting today, talking this week about how we can best support, use the tools we have to get the truth out. And then we're going to see where it leads. And we know that this president, if you read the Mueller report and see the very real obstruction of justice that's laid out in that report by this president, as we get more financial documents to review, I think the picture is going to become clearer for the American people. And that's our goal, is to use our constitutional oversight responsibilities to get the facts out. And I think that when we are able to do that through litigation, through investigation, American sentiment is going to change.
Our last two questions.
You mentioned a minute ago that, in answer to Paul's question, that the Democrats need to focus on their agenda, like prescription drugs and infrastructure. But we haven't seen major action on those items. And I'm wondering if you think the Democrats, especially given what happened last night, need to hurry up and do some of those things in order to convince voters that they're serious.
Well, we have taken several steps as it relates to prescription drug pricing and dealing with the anti-competitive behavior of the pharmaceutical industry. We're united behind the fact that Big Pharma is totally out of control. The American people pay more for life-saving medication than in any other country in the world. That is unacceptable, including in the countries to our north and to our south. There is no justification for it. And we do believe that there's a bipartisan pathway toward doing something to drive down the high costs of life-saving prescription drugs if you take President Trump at his word. Now, the House Judiciary Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, and the House Energy and Commerce Committee have all passed legislation to deal with things like the pay-for-delay practices of Big Pharma. That's a significant step forward. And I would expect that at some point you'll see bills dealing with those issues on the floor of the House of Representatives. The fact that pharmaceutical companies, understanding that they face competition from generic drugs as the brand name drug patents are about to expire, have been engaging in a practice of paying the generic companies not to put the generic drugs on the market, called pay for delay, is egregious. It's so outrageous that even my Republican colleagues agree that it should be stopped. And so I think there are steps that we've moved to take to deal with those issues. Generic drugs having the same medicinal impact, according to the FDA, as brand name drugs, but costing the American people up to 80% less. So you have anti-competitive practices that we're dealing with, like pay for delay, and we'll continue to deal with forcefully. We also need to deal with the issue of drug price negotiation. And it's my expectation that that conversation and activity in that regard will be escalating sooner rather than later. Last question.
On the drug price negotiation, can we expect an official version of leadership's proposal there this week?
Yeah, I don't know the timing as it relates to when Speaker Pelosi and those committee chairs who have been involved in the discussions as it relates to the drug price negotiation bill have concluded should be released for discussion, but I would expect that that is going to happen sooner rather than later.
Your progressive members have been encouraged by some early signs that there won't be an arbitration process included in there. Is that an assurance that you can give them that will continue to not be in there?
Well, every single legislative effort, particularly when you have sweeping pieces of legislation that are necessary to make life better for the American people, are works in progress. I think everyone has been encouraged by the early signs and the leadership that we've seen as it relates to tackling the issue of prescription drug pricing in an appropriately aggressive way that is bold and aspirational, but also designed to open up the door to possibly getting something over the finish line with the Senate Republican majority and Donald Trump in the White House. Thank you.